A warm greeting to you. Today is Monday, July 27, 2026. I'm meteorologist Ruben Garcia. In today's video, I'll be discussing several topics. First, the powerful Hurricane Genevieve, which is currently in the eastern Pacific region and last night reached Category 5 hurricane strength with maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour, or 260 kilometers per hour. Then, in the second part of the video, I'll provide an update on El Niño conditions, which continue to break records. At the end, I'll give a projection of what is expected in terms of tropical cyclone activity over the coming weeks, both in the eastern Pacific and the Atlantic basin. So first, let's talk about Hurricane Genevieve, which, as you can see, looks very impressive on the infrared satellite imagery. Although it reached Category 5 strength last night, becoming the first Category 5 hurricane in the eastern Pacific since 2024, it is currently a Category 4 hurricane. Remember that these intensity fluctuations in major hurricanes are completely normal, and there is a possibility that it could strengthen again. At least the good news is that it continues on a west-northwest track, well away from the coasts of Mexico and Central America. Therefore, and fortunately, Hurricane Genevieve poses no threat to land. If we zoom in on the infrared satellite animation, you can see just how impressive the hurricane structure is, with a well-defined circulation center and a completely clear, symmetrical eye, characteristics that are typical of Category 4 or 5 hurricanes. Looking at the National Hurricane Center forecast, you can see that it continues to project a west to west-northwest track over the open Pacific waters during the next 5 days. Beginning tomorrow, Tuesday, it should start to weaken gradually as it moves over progressively cooler sea surface temperatures. I imagine many of you are wondering whether Hurricane Genevieve is associated with El Niño. The answer is that it is very likely this hurricane reached this intensity thanks to the sea surface temperature anomalies related to the historic El Niño event we currently have in the Pacific. Over the next few minutes, we'll take a look at how it has evolved during the past several weeks. And remember that El Niño usually results in above-normal tropical cyclone activity across the central and eastern Pacific. Although we have not experienced hyperactive tropical cyclone activity so far, more hurricanes are expected to develop during the coming months, and it remains to be seen whether any of them will eventually affect parts of Mexico, Central America, or even the Hawaiian Islands, where Hurricane Fausto is currently heading. Fausto is expected to pass just north of the archipelago as a weak tropical storm. So let's take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, and we continue to see that El Niño is strengthening in the Niño 3.4 region. In fact, it has been strengthening at a faster rate than the models had projected. As a result, it is becoming increasingly likely that El Niño will eventually become the strongest on record. Notice that just west of Ecuador and Peru, sea surface temperature anomalies are already exceeding 4 degrees Celsius, which is truly remarkable. In fact, to give you an idea of the strengthening of El Niño and the sea surface temperature anomalies in the region, on this graph, the red shading and the areas marked with parallel lines indicate regions where sea surface temperatures are currently at record levels. In other words, temperatures have never been this warm for this date since records began. So El Niño and these temperature anomalies are definitely helping to support the development of some impressive hurricanes such as Hurricane Genevieve. In the next image, you can see how the Niño 3.4 region has evolved over the past several weeks. Notice that it is currently averaging close to 29.5 degrees Celsius, which at this time represents a historic record. In other words, for this date, in no previous year since records began has such a high sea surface temperature been observed as what we are seeing right now. Unfortunately, the projections indicate that El Niño will continue strengthening as we approach October and November. It is possible that it could reach or even surpass the historical record. When we compare it with the last strong El Niño event, which occurred in 1997, you can see that although the subsurface temperature anomalies along the equatorial Pacific are similar, the reality is that these anomalies now extend farther into the central Pacific. This means that in terms of both intensity and duration, the 2026 El Niño event is likely to be stronger than the one we experienced in 1997. At least over the next 2 weeks, and after Hurricane Genevieve moves through the eastern Pacific, the models are not projecting much tropical cyclone activity, so it is possible that we will experience a pause of about 10 days, with the exception of perhaps a new cyclone that could develop south of the Hawaiian Islands in the central Pacific. This is related to the current phase of the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which is located over parts of Africa and promotes the development of strong tropical waves in the Atlantic. However, this pattern will begin changing again by early August, when another phase of the Madden-Julian Oscillation will once again promote cyclone formation across the central and eastern Pacific. And speaking a little about the Atlantic, we currently do have several strong tropical waves between the Caribbean and Africa. However, conditions are extremely unfavorable for development because of the effects of El Niño. particularly the strong wind shear that continues across parts of the Caribbean Sea and the tropical Atlantic, so conditions are simply not favorable for tropical cyclone formation. In fact, it is very likely that if we did not have El Niño this year, some of the tropical waves emerging from Africa would, in theory, have opportunities for development because of the current phase of the Madden-Julian oscillation. But as I mentioned, notice in this image the belt of strong wind shear extending from Central America across the Caribbean Sea, creating conditions that currently prevent the development of any tropical depression or tropical storm. That is why, so far this year, the Atlantic has produced only 2 tropical storms, Tropical Storm Arthur and Tropical Storm Bertha. Both of them formed over the northern Gulf of Mexico, because although El Niño typically reduces tropical cyclone activity in the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic, it is normal to see tropical cyclones during strong El Niño years become concentrated over the southeastern United States and the northern Gulf of Mexico. We can see that in the next image shared by Michael Lowry, where the blue shading highlights the areas that typically experience a reduction in tropical cyclones during strong El Niño events. It is no surprise that, overall, the regions that see the least tropical cyclone activity during El Niño years are the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, the central North Atlantic and the waters near Bermuda are where tropical cyclone activity typically becomes concentrated during strong El Niño years. Compare that with the regions where we see increased tropical cyclone activity during strong La Niña years. In comparison, we can see that El Niño and La Niña essentially produce opposite effects. Looking farther ahead, over the next 2 weeks the Atlantic is very likely to remain quiet, although we will be watching the area between Bermuda and the eastern United States, since some long-range models indicate the development of a low-pressure system there. In fact, this almost perfectly matches the region where tropical cyclone activity typically occurs during El Niño years. In addition, El Niño produces several changes in the distribution of tropical cyclones across the Atlantic. Notice that it usually delays the beginning of the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season, with tropical cyclone activity beginning to increase significantly by the middle of August. However, remember that this year's forecasts indicate that we are expected to have a hurricane season that is well below normal across the Atlantic basin. So here at Hurricane Info, I will continue monitoring both the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic, although at the moment, and fortunately, there is no threat of a tropical cyclone making landfall. Before I go, I'd like to invite you to give this video a like if you enjoy this content. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you'll be notified whenever I upload new videos. I hope everyone has an excellent start to the week. See you next time.